In this podcast, I talk with Dr. Tommy Wood, neuroscientist and author of the upcoming book, The Stimulated Mind. We talk about dementia, early brain development, and how you can maximize your brain's performance in a few easy steps. And talking about the brain, thanks to All You Need Nutrition for sponsoring this episode. You probably know that creatine is good for your muscles, but did you know it can also help your brain? Check out All You Need's creatine and their other products and use the code UPSIDE, UPSIDE, at checkout to get 10% off of your next order. Now, without any further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Tommy Wood. Hey, Tommy, so could you define dementia for us, please?
Sure. So dementia is an umbrella term for a number of conditions that result in a decline of cognitive function over time to the point where an individual is no longer able to look after themselves on a day-to-day basis. The most common cause of dementia is Alzheimer's disease. That makes up maybe 60 to 80%. But there are other causes like vascular dementia, which actually occurs with Alzheimer's disease quite frequently. And then some other dementias, dementia with Lewy bodies. There's dementia that comes from Parkinson's disease, frontotemporal dementia. When we think about all the different kinds of dementia, those first two I mentioned are really something that I think we can focus on because they make up 70 to 90% of dementias. And the majority of those are probably preventable if we are able to line up all the different lifestyle and other risk factors that contribute to them.
Could you go a little bit deeper into the physiological basis of dementia? How does it present when you start measuring what's happening inside the brain and in the body?
So there's actually two different questions, right? What's the physiological basis and what's the presentation? Because, and depending on the individual, that could actually be thousands of different questions. Because when you look at the brains of individuals with dementia, and now we're talking all kinds of dementia, each of them has a different pattern of what you see under a microscope. And traditionally, when we think about dementia and Alzheimer's disease, we think about amyloid proteins. So it's the buildup of this protein in neurons that affects their function. Amyloid seems to accumulate in the brain when brains are stressed for a variety of reasons. And then that triggers this process, we think, with the accumulation of another protein called tau that sort of the fancy word is it becomes hyperphosphorylated, but that basically just means that it's sort of like it gets bound and tangled together. Essentially, they're called tau tangles. And again, these sort of like damage the neurons. And this sort of pathology accumulates over time and negatively affects cognitive function. But a whole bunch of other stuff seems to be happening at the same time. So, like I mentioned, there's vascular dementia. This is where the blood vessels disease that can cause small clots or just issues with getting blood to the right places in the brain at the right time. And then we see there are changes to the cells in the brain, to the immune cells in the brain, like the microglia. There are changes to other cells in the brain, like astrocytes. They regulate fluid flow. In addition to the neurons, there's changes in the white matter. This is kind of the part of our brain that's it's not uniquely human, but the white matter in the human brain is much more expanded compared to other species. It's responsible for all the fast connections between different parts of the brain. And we see changes there too. So changes in white matter actually seem to better track with changes in cognitive function and dementia than the amount of amyloid somebody has in their brain. So all of this stuff is happening at the same time. So when you look at these we look at an individual, they will have one specific pattern of things going on, and they're all a little different. This then also mirrors what you see clinically, because there's this old adage in neurology, which is that when you've seen one patient with Alzheimer's disease, you've seen one patient with Alzheimer's disease, because each person experiences the disease differently. Different changes in their function, different trajectories over time, different risk factors. So, and then the final piece is that those two don't necessarily map onto each other, right? So there are people who have brains that look, kind of okay, and as you get older, there's some wear and tear, and that that's all right. Normally people can handle that. That's part of normal aging, and cognitive function is just fine. But with that amount of wear and tear or pathology, some people might have significant changes in cognitive function and experience dementia. And on the other side, there are people whose brains look like they must have dementia. They must have Alzheimer's disease, surely. Like, there's all these proteins and like all this build up, but their brains function just fine. And that then means that there are a bunch of different factors that affect the connection between what you see in the brain and what you see in the individual. And all of those things can be different from person to person. So we can talk about what are the factors that increase or decrease the likelihood that we'll accumulate pathology in the brain, like amyloid. And we can also talk about the factors of like what things protect us from getting dementia, even if we do have amyloid in our brain. That's a process called resilience. And all of these seem to be tied to very similar factors, but we have to kind of identify what's most important in that one person that might be causing a change or not.
That reminds me of spine MRIs.
And
how you could have essentially a fucked up spine and be pain-free and fully functional, and you could have a perfectly looking spine and be fucked up.
And like,
does that track?
Knee X-rays with osteoarthritis, and it's the same, right? You could look at that and be like, how does that person walk on that knee? And they're running 5Ks and they feel just fine.
So I guess you always have to take. Do you always take both into account? You take obviously the clinical presentation is going to be part of the diagnosis, and then do you always go with scans and more, let's call it maybe in-depth testing when you're evaluating somebody and trying to find the right path to either mitigating it or maybe preventing it if you catch it early enough?
So the field is really just starting to figure this stuff out. So as you might imagine, most people only start to get brain scans and maybe blood tests when something has started to happen, right? They're already experiencing cognitive decline. Either they feel it themselves, or it's been noticed by a loved one. That's common too. And then where you can measure on a brain scan like how much amyloid or tau a person has. You can measure some of these in the blood. So there are now some like validated tests you can do on a blood test for different forms of amyloid and tau that kind of predict how much you would have in your brain. And sort of part of this bigger picture is then, are there some medications or therapies that we could use to reduce that? And that's sort of one aspect of the field. The other part, and where I focus more, so most of my research is in the bit before that, is sort of like the prevention. How can we minimize risk? And you can sort of statistically estimate how much dementia we might be able to prevent, depending on who you ask. It's somewhere between 45 and 70-ish%, based on a whole variety of risk factors. And like the face that you just made is the face that most people make, because people don't realize that this is the case. But this is now like fairly well established that a lot of dementia should be preventable. So then, where I tend to focus is like, how can we stack the deck in our favor so it's most likely that we don't experience dementia? And in that setting, yes, there are some clinics that do something called preventative neurology, where regardless of how old you are or what you've experienced, they'll do brain scans, they'll do blood tests, they'll fully assess all your risk factors, and then they'll try and move the needle on that. That's not something that most people have access to yet, although will certainly increase over time. But we know there are very basic blood tests for physical health, nutrition status that can be addressed, most of which most people can get from their doctor. We know there are a whole bunch of other risk factors related to lifestyle and the environment that we can modify. So my focus is like, where can individuals figure out, like, what's the thing that is probably going to have the biggest impact for me that I can change, that's going to then sort of stack the deck in my favor in the long term.
So we're obviously going to go over those factors and what we can do over time to prevent that. And you hinted at that, right? Lifestyle factors, things that are inherently under our control, are going to be part of that conversation. Do you have do you think that we could have a fairly good estimation of risk based on just a questionnaire of lifestyle factors and habits and how the person lives day to day? Would that encompass enough of the answer to get a good estimate, or do you have to go to the testing side of things?
Based on sort of big observational epidemiological studies, there's a pretty good, you can definitely guesstimate it. You can get in the right ballpark. So there was a study from the Rush Memory and Aging Project in the US where they sort of tracked a population of individuals in their 60s and older, and then they sort of documented, it was 5 healthy lifestyle factors. So, was their diet good? Were they physically active? Were they cognitively active? Did they smoke? And did they drink too much alcohol? And based on that, over several decades of age, right, that the sort of full age range, 60 to 100, if you had 4 out of 5 of those good sort of protective factors, right, didn't smoke, didn't drink too much, etc., your risk of being diagnosed with dementia was about half that of somebody who only had 0 to 1 of those lifestyle factors. So it wasn't completely preventative or protective, right? There were still some people in that group who experienced dementia, and of course, this is not a randomized controlled trial. This is just we're sort of measuring what people are doing and estimating their risk. But that was the question, right? That's the question that you asked. Like, can we just predict somebody's risk? And so even that, a 50% reduction in risk based on some very simple lifestyle factors. And you could probably improve that with some more detailed questions. And you ask somebody about their diet, but what you really care is what's the physiological effect of that diet, right? There are markers of whether you've got enough nutrients, and there are markers of whether you're experiencing what I call excess energy availability or metabolic syndrome. So we can definitely get more detail, but yes, just some basics of knowing somebody's lifestyle is enough to have a pretty good estimate of what their risk might look like.
And based on what you mentioned, there's essentially 2 big sides of the equation. There's the fuel that you put into the engine. If we simplify and very much simplify the human body as an engine, it is, I guess, a conversion engine, right? We take in electron transported molecules, and then we extract the energy from that with multiple ways, and just to run this meat sack that we have and what we want to do with it. So there's the stuff that you put inside, and then there's how the engine functions itself. So there's the fuel and the quality of the fuel. Is it appropriate? And then there's the engine and how big the engine is, both at the metabolic level and the brain level, because you said you talked about brain activity and cognitive activity being key, and we'll definitely dive into this a little bit more. Would you agree with that kind of simplification? There's those 2 sides, and they both matter.
So yes, I those 2 sides absolutely matter. My personal model, and there's no perfect model yet. If we fully understood the human brain, this would be much simpler, but we don't.
You're probably the best place to know that we're far from it.
Yeah, neuroscientists, and I can say this because I am one. We often like to think that we have a full handle on what's happening in the brain, but we don't. And some might argue that we probably never will. There's a nice poem which is that if the brain was simple enough for us to understand it, then we would be so simple that we wouldn't understand it. You know what I mean? So it's that. This is just sort of part of the interesting part of the problem, or one of the interesting parts of the problem. So my model of the brain has 3 components, and you kind of actually alluded to them. You just put them in slightly different buckets, and that model looks very similar to what we might talk about in physical performance, which is the stimulus recovery adaptation model. It's quite similar. It's quite similar to that. So the idea is that there are 3 main components that kind of interact, right? more of one drives more of the other. It's not a list of things that we need. It's sort of like an interconnected network. And this is what I call the 3S model. And the 3 S's are stimulus, supply, and support. Much like physical function, and I draw lots of comparisons to physical function because, I am a meathead myself. I like lifting weights. I've been an athlete for a long period of time. And so this is how I understand it, right? If you want to improve physical function, you need to apply a stimulus, right? If you want bigger biceps, which is something that I think everybody should want, right, you can eat the best possible diet and you can take as many naps as you want, but your biceps aren't going to get bigger unless you do bicep curls. And those other things will improve the gains that you'll get from your bicep curls, right? So they are important, but the curls are the stimulus. And the brain really seems to be the same. The human brain, compared to other species, I mean, this is true for any species, but the human brain in particular is designed, for want of a better word, it is evolved to be uniquely adaptive to its environment. The human comes out essentially completely useless and inept, right? You've seen human babies compared to other species, right? They can do essentially nothing. And that early weakness is because the parts of the brain that are responsible for our most complex cognitive functions are essentially a completely blank slate when we're born, because it's just like waiting to experience the environment to kind of drive the development of those parts of the brain. And this is really what determines, or the primary determinant of our cognitive function. So how do we use our brains both during development and then later in life? So that stimulus, I think, is sort of the primary driver, and includes a whole bunch of things like education and skill learning, motor skills, social interaction, languages, music, all that kind of stuff. This is what shapes how our brain functions. And then, right, so we've got a stimulus, and hopefully we continue to apply stimuli across the entire lifespan, right? You want to maintain physical function. You can't just get a bunch of gains in your 20s and then enjoy them for another 6 decades. Unfortunately, you have to keep putting in the work. And again, the brain seems to be the same. But then when you activate a part of the brain with a certain skill, say, or some learning or social interaction, you have these networks in the brain that become activated. What happens then is that those areas of the brain, they start to demand more resources. So like what you were talking, right? So they need more blood, they need more oxygen, they need more fuel, primarily glucose, but could be ketones and lactate, and right? So lots of different options there, as long as you're have the metabolism, the healthy metabolism, to be able to provide them, and then some critical nutrients to kind of build or support those parts of the brain that are being activated. And so this is my supply bucket. So it requires a healthy cardiovascular system. It requires healthy metabolism, right? So you can have the supply of those energy substrates, and it requires good nutrient status. And so nutrients that we know are really critical for the brain, maintaining synapses and mitochondria and myelin, which sort of is the sheath of the white matter that allows those fast connections, include things like omega-3 fatty acids, B vitamins, iron, vitamin D, magnesium. There are some like antioxidant polyphenols that seem to be really beneficial for the brain. You can get those from olive oil or coffee or berries, right? And so all of these are kind of in that bucket. And then the last part is the sort of the recovery part or support, which is that we've stimulated the brain, we've brought in all these extra resources to allow that function to happen and kind of support any process of neuroplasticity or adaptation that occurs in response to the stimulus. But then that adaptation really occurs during rest, right? You go to the gym, you do bicep curls, and then growth happens afterwards. And so sleep is the most critical. It's sort of part of this bucket. But if we're thinking about cognitive function on a day-to-day basis, for like you and I, also just having periods where your brain is allowed to like recover during the day is really important too. And most people who do, you know, beginning today, end of day, and it's a long day, and they do work at home, right? It's the same as an amateur athlete who just goes out and just runs hard for hours and hours a day, and then they wonder why they get stress fractures and they're overtrained. And this is what we're doing to our brains on a daily basis. So that recovery piece is really critical, but there are other aspects of that sort of fit into that bucket too. So other aspects of stress essentially creates a hypermetabolic state in certain parts of the brain that is then preventing those aspects of recovery. So finding ways to deal with chronic stresses as much as possible, and then avoiding different factors that might impair our ability to adapt. So this could be exposures that we have. Alcohol is a common one. Smoking is a common one. Things like air pollution are common too. So all those kind of fit into my support bucket. But those are the three main parts. Essentially very similar to the version that you envisioned, and they all kind of work together, right? We know that if you stimulate a part of the brain, that part of the brain has a greater drive for sleep the following night, just like it also has a greater drive to bring in more nutrients and blood flow and that kind of stuff. So each of these things are kind of interconnected in real time.
Yeah, just like a part of your body that has been stimulated through a workout is going to require more resources to recover during the nighttime following. It's really interesting what you said about the hyper metabolic state of stressed areas in the brain when it comes to chronic stress. Is there any parallel with the kind of hyper or overfiring around chronic pain in the body, like of certain areas? Is it linked at all?
Oh, that's a good question. I haven't thought about that, and I probably couldn't give you a perfect answer immediately. But you could draw parallels there. So the areas of the brain that have been best studied in terms of this chronic stress picture are things like the hippocampus, which is sort of in the medial temporal area, which is essentially like just inside your ears-ish, inside your brain, just like sort of nestled under the brain, just inside your ears. And the hippocampus is really important for memory. It's one of the parts of the brain that's particularly susceptible to things like vascular changes in vascular dementia, but also in Alzheimer's disease. And when you look at chronic stress, it seems that the hippocampus in particular, essentially, it increases its metabolism, so it never gets the chance, or it's less likely to get the chance to kind of recover and adapt. So yes, it's more active, just like you might see greater firing in areas that they're experiencing chronic pain. So although it might be a difference between sort of external versus internal forces that are driving that firing, but yeah, some of that maladaptation could certainly be compared one to the other.
You've been talking quite a bit about different parts of the metabolism in the body, but there's also stuff in the brain going on, right? We use a lot of resources, nutrients, oxygen inside the brain. Can you talk about the mitochondrial side of the brain? And I saw, you've probably seen it, I saw it on Twitter a little while back. It was a map of the brain's mitochondria that they were able to make out of, I think, slices of the brain that they extracted, and it was a really cool picture. If you haven't seen it, I'll send it to you. But talk about the role of mitochondria inside the brain, and do you see a strong link between mitochondrial function and maybe dysfunction and dementia and brain function in general?
Yeah, so there are some people who basically said that mitochondrial dysfunction is sort of the primary driver of dementia and maybe several neurodegenerative disorders, and I think that's absolutely a case you could easily make. So if you're thinking about any function in any part of the body, right, if you don't have energy to do that, right, you're never going to be able to drive that function. So this is then, right, we know that mitochondrial function and mitochondrial signaling is critical for, say, immune function in the brain. Like, so I mentioned microglia earlier, right? We know that in the setting of chronic inflammation or after injuries in the brain, you see changes in mitochondrial function. That's linked to how those microglia function themselves. That then changes how they interact with neurons and other cells in the brain that can result in sort of impairment of how they function. Mitochondria are really important for deciding which neurons get myelinated. They're really important for regulating the synapses, so the connections between neurons, and all of that. So the phrase is immunometabolism, right? This direct connection or intimate link between how, like, the energetic state of a cell and how it functions in the immune system. And so this is the case. You make this case for every individual cell, and the same factors can influence or impair mitochondrial function across multiple cell types and multiple regions of the brain. At the same time, we know some things about mitochondrial function that kind of fit into that model that I already described. So mitochondrial function is stimulus driven, right? So if you apply a stimulus, you increase demand, you increase the sort of the energy draw through the mitochondria, right? They adapt and enhance their function and energy production. And you can see, so one example is, if we're trying to measure mitochondrial function in the brain, there are a few different ways to do it, right? You can sort of like isolate the mitochondria and you can put them in a machine that kind of measures all the different aspects of the electron transport chain, all the different complexes. There's a machine called a seahorse that is most commonly used to do this. But you can also, more commonly, you might just measure the number of proteins or the activity of a certain protein from a mitochondria in the brain. And you can see in multiple different models in the lab, as well as in humans with Alzheimer's disease, cytochrome C oxidase, so complex 4 of the mitochondria, is very commonly downregulated or less active, regardless of how you induce that. So you can induce it through a chronic ischemia, right? So low blood flow to the brain will downregulate mitochondrial function. You can do it with toxins, and they've done it with things like cyanide, but it could also be, alcohol and smoking and other things. You'll see downregulation of these functions. You can do it by decreasing environmental enrichment or environmental stimulation, right? So decreasing stimulus. And you see this in animals and you see this in humans. So I think that when we're sort of talking about the conceptual model of what are the inputs that drive function, a lot of it you could directly tie to the function of the mitochondria, right? I mentioned omega-3 fatty acids earlier. DHA, one of the long chain omega-3 fatty acids is critical for mitochondrial function. It has weird electrophysical properties that can only be taken by DHA, in the brain, at least. DHA accumulates in the mitochondria and in the synapses between neurons. It has this very specific function. So yeah, you could say that the mitochondria are probably the hub where a lot of the response and output to all those inputs that I mentioned earlier, that's where they're generated.
One thing you mentioned before is early brain development in childhood. If for people that are parents listening to this, or that maybe will be parents one day, how can we give the best cards to our kids? What should we do in terms of the environment that we create for them and around them, so that they have the most stimulus on that front and that they can benefit the most and maybe, reduce those risks as much as possible. Let me interrupt this episode to tell you that if you want to learn how to create training programs with AI in just a few clicks, I absolutely can't help you. But if you want to learn how to design fully personalized programs from start to finish for your athletes, I run a 12-week online mastermind course for coaches and physios like you who want to learn and get better. Click the link in the description to learn more and join the waitlist for the next season of the Upside Strength Endurance Mastermind. Now back to the podcast.
So, I feel like nowadays I have to give the caveat that I don't have my own kids, so I'm now telling people what they should do for their own kids, even though I don't have that experience myself. Although maybe that makes me like a objective bystander. I'm not sure, but take that.
I'll let you know. I'll filter that and I'll let you know.
So, in reality, there are two parts of this, and what we have, some are physiological and some are sort of philosophical, right? So to a certain extent, that brain is going to do what it's going to do, and there's not that much that you can't control it that much. And I think probably a big issue that we've had with parenting in recent years is that we've tried to control it too much. But that brain is kind of hard.
What do you mean by that?
Oh, so we can get straight into it. So I think there's an increasing amount of evidence that in recent generations so in adolescence right now, there's an increased burden of mental health issues. We have more girls being prescribed antidepressants and experiencing depression and anxiety. We have more boys dying by suicide. This is not scare tactics. This is just statistics. And I'm not saying this happens to everybody, but just the risks are increasing. And some of that is coming from the social environment. Is probably, some of it's going to be a little bit of technology. It's going to be a little bit of, social media and these other things. But what's also kind of increased in that period of time is this sort of safetyism idea where we're so scared of our kids being injured or getting lost or getting abducted that they sort of, there's a certain tranche of parents who've sort of tried to hyper control what those kids do, be it from making sure they do their homework through to you can't go out at night when it's dark, and you can't go and do that because there's a risk of injury. And and again, right, we're talking sort of just group averages and population averages. This is not trying to tell one particular parent that they did something wrong. But when you look at the development of cognitive and social and emotional skills, some risk is required. And the human brain, as it develops, seeks those inputs, right? So this is what I say, that that brain is gonna, it's I have to go and learn this stuff. And the way that I'm going to learn this stuff is to go out into the world and I'm going to touch that and I'm going to put that in my mouth and I'm going to try and climb that, right? Because it craves those inputs. So when we restrict that, we decrease some of that learning. So you can see from kids who are allowed to engage in outdoor and risky play, they tend to have better some improvement in motor and cognitive skills, but also emotional skills, better emotional regulation, right? They've tried some stuff and they failed and they fell over and they fell over and they've skinned their knee and maybe they got lost. That's what I mean by risky play. It's something that it forces you to kind of stay at the edge of your current skills, and you might fall over and you might have a minor injury and you might get lost or something like that. But that's where those kids get to test their abilities and then have to deal with it themselves. And when you don't learn that later in life, you can see things like poorer emotional regulation because they never had to actually learn it. They never had to do it. So they never learn those skills. There are some studies that suggest that kids who don't get those opportunities to take risks and learn then seek greater risks later in life. So it might be, more serious, more serious risk taking that may involve some criminal behavior or may involve more drug taking, or because that brain is seeking those inputs. And you can't say that if you don't let your kid play outside, they're going to be a drug user later in life. That's not what I'm saying, but it's these opportunities to kind of learn these skills that the brain really needs. So one thing is kind of, maybe you have to put a few kind of guardrails in place, but letting that brain explore and take risks as much as possible is really critical, because that's kind of, that learning is driving it. So that's what I mean. Does that answer your question?
It does. And it makes me think of that balance that's required between input and output as well, both from a bodily standpoint, where you need the inputs of scraping your knee and learning that was too high for now, or that you have to be careful with this, or that speed was a little too much for that jump. But then you have the output of using the body, and it can't just be information coming in, right? Because I was thinking about obviously phones and screens and social media and the amount of information that we're bombarded with day in and day out. But that's not enough, right? The stimulus can't just be inwards. You have to have the outward part. You were talking about music, you were talking about social interactions. And so we need both of those, right? We need the input and we need the output on the physical side, on an emotional side, on a mental side. So essentially you just need to behave like a human, right? Talk to people you don't know, say hi, be social. One thing that I see in young people, we have 3 kids with my wife. One thing that I see in teenagers and the younger generation in general is the fear of making a mistake. And that seems like a huge barrier to actually taking action in anything. And also probably the unrealistic expectations that the best of the best set on social media and on Instagram and whatnot, where if all you see all day long is like the best gymnast and then the best musician and then the best so-and-so, when you're starting, you suck. You can't do shit. But that's where you have to start, and you have to accept that you're going to have to walk through mud for a while, and it's not even going to be good. And then you got to keep doing that. And I feel like that there's such a disconnect and setting such high expectations, and like you said, and then not letting people actually experience things, or kids experience things and try. So we need to find a solution. And I guess the going outside and being physically active for me has to be the simplest thing, right? Kids have to play together. They learn social rules, norms, communication, and they also go through that energy flux of moving your body, of needing to eat more. We moved from Switzerland to France a couple months ago, and we were so lucky. We fell on a school, which is a public school, but the kid, my son, he's 11, our son, he has about 10 hours of sports a week. It's not even like a special school or anything. He's just like, today he had 2 hours of gym this morning and 2 hours of cycling this afternoon. And he comes home and he's not the same kid as before, or during the holidays where he's bouncing off the walls. Like, he needs to channel that and get it out. So the input is important and the output is as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This makes me think of a few things. There was a very nice paper that sort of informed a lot of my thinking on this, like how much capacity we have to improve our own cognitive function, basically regardless of age, written by Christopher Herzog and a few other people. And they had 3 main components required for enhancing or supporting cognitive function. And one was what they called enhancing the function of the neural substrate, which is kind of like a fancy term for some of the stuff we talked about, being physically fit, nutrient status, that kind of stuff. And then and then the next one was how that brain is used and stimulated, right? So accumulating those skills and that kind of stuff. But then the third was expressing those skills out in the real world with other people, right? It's not enough to learn it; you have to then use it. So that's exactly what you're saying. And I think this idea of what it takes to learn is really critical, and this also feeds into what you're talking about in terms of mistakes and failure. And this is something that I think we as adults need to really learn ourselves, but based on the way you said it, now I'm thinking that one of the things that we could be experiencing is that we've moved the point at which we become scared of making mistakes and failure earlier and earlier and earlier in life, and maybe we're seeing some of the downstream effects of that, right? Because traditionally, kids don't care if they fall over and fail, right? They're just like,
they shouldn't care.
They shouldn't care. Like, this is all information. This is all
their job
inputs.
is not to care.
No, exactly. And you know, we often like marvel at kids. They're like, I can't believe that they tried that. I can't believe they did that. And then they fell over, and then they did it again. And probably the where you will always see this is like a kid learning how to walk. So my sister has a daughter, my niece. They were visiting us recently, and she's in that. She's sort of like, they were with us for like 2 weeks. And you could kind of see her improving, like her ability to crawl. Like she was just kind of moving a bit when she arrived, and then by the end, she was just like zooming across the carpet like nobody's business in just like 2 weeks. And then she's slowly like trying to like stand up and grab things. And then this is like my sister's like, oh yeah, so she'll try and grab something, and then immediately what will happen is she'll bonk her head on the side of it and fall over, and then she'll try again and again, and this all just inputs, right? She doesn't care that she bonked her head. She might care for a second, and I care that she probably, we shouldn't bonk our heads too much. And obviously nothing actually bad happened, but it's that kind of willingness and like craving that next step in function and improvement, and they know, or they don't care that requires failure, right? And then you do all these complex inputs, you fail a few times, and then you sleep a bunch as the brain kind of reorganizes itself based on those inputs. And this essentially is critical to learning. So the primary driver of neuroplasticity, so making new connections or maintaining connections that you have, kind of part of neuroplasticity is also pruning connections you don't need, so the ones that you do have are more efficient, right? That's actually most of what happens during brain development. It requires this mismatch between expectation or desire and reality, right? So if you're already really good at something, your brain's like, well, okay, we're good. Like, we don't need to change. This is it. We got it locked down. But if you try and do something and you fail at it, the brain's like, okay, so like, what was the difference between what I wanted to do and what I actually did? And then it starts to reorganize and direct resources to minimize that mismatch. So it's funny because there are whole papers, like this whole field of educational psychology that focuses on the importance of failure and making mistakes, because that's a really important driver of learning. And at the same time, the formal education system basically makes kids feel like they can't or they shouldn't fail. And so there's this big mismatch between what's required for learning and the environment that we create for learning. So that is really critical. Appreciating that it's the discomfort and that friction of like not being able to do something that you want to do. That's actually the primary driver of these changes that then sort of support overall cognitive function over time. And that's important, right? Very important for kids. And traditionally kids just kind of like did it and they were like, this is information, this is useful. Whereas adults, we hate being bad at stuff, but especially when somebody else is watching. It's like you could already kind of feel that cringy feeling of like you get kind of hot and sweaty as like this person is watching you like make like completely ham-fistedly do whatever it is you're trying to do. But it's that feeling that's actually driving some of those changes in the brain, right? You release neurotransmitters like dopamine, and that goes up and down depending on the inputs. Norepinephrine, right, which is really, really important for like driving that kind of focus. And that's why you kind of get that sort of slightly anxious feeling, right? It's a stress hormone when you fail at something. But that's what's really critical. So if anything, we need to allow kids to do more of that, and then also embrace more of that ourselves, especially as we, leave education and go and do the same thing again and again and again and again in our work every day. We're missing out on that critical input.
And I guess it's so much the same as when we talk about adaptation of the body to a physical stimulus, right? We have that adaptation or accommodation curve or trend where when you do something new, and that's true in training, and I'm sure it's true with cognitive function as well, when you do something new, you actually adapt really fast because it's a new stimulus, so it has more of an impact on the cells in general, and they will respond in a bigger or in a stronger way. But then it's something that you're habituated to, that you've done a lot, you have less of that response because, again, you're just used to it now. And so hence the importance of changing that stimulus and trying something new, and yes, sucking at it at first. What are some new skills that we should be learning as adults if we're not already doing it, in your opinion?
So what's nice is that it seems that there's a whole range of skills and experiences that we can expose ourselves to that have broadly similar effects and similar benefits long term. So it's probably more important to just like have a diversity of things rather than say like this is the one thing that you need to do to protect your brain, right? We all know lots of people who've had good cognitive function late into their 80s and 90s, and they all, did life very differently and had different hobbies and different skills and that kind of stuff. So it's the process of engaging in learning and some of what I would call like core human skills, like primarily that are probably going to be the biggest levers. So that's new languages, that's musical instruments, it's complex motor skills. So when we think about physical activity, right, there are multiple different categories. We think about aerobic exercise, resistance training, and those are important, and we can talk about the different areas of the brain that those different types of exercise affect. But what seems to have the greatest sort of bang for your buck is open skill exercise. So things that they have a physical component, but they also have a complex motor skill as well as a cognitive component. So ball sports, in the US, like pickleball is a massive thing in like older groups, and that's actually a really good example, right? It requires social skills because you have to, right? You have to play doubles basically most of the time for pickleball, and it's got a physical component, and the scoring system is immensely complex. So it's actually like you have to do a mental arithmetic just to like actually know what the score is. So those kinds of and when you're playing, you're constantly having to respond to the environment, right? Where's the ball coming from? Where's my partner? Like all that kind of stuff at the same time seems to be really beneficial. But it could be any ball sport, any board sport, anything that requires some more sort of complex orientation of your meat sack in 3D space just creates more like cognitive stimulus. So these are kind of the core things. Dancing seems to be like have an outsized effect on pretty much every cognitive and mental health outcome. And I think because for the same reasons, right? Social, music, fun, physically active, like all those kinds of things come together. So basically any new skill, especially a complex skill, it is going to be providing some of these inputs. So there's a whole raft. You can pick whatever you want, really, which is nice. It's just like it's important that it has that sort of element of failure and learning, and there's probably going to be some magic sauce if it also comes in like a social component, because we know that's really important. That's really important too. So those are kinds of the groups of activities that I think probably have the biggest bang for your buck. But there's also evidence for things like brain training, right, which you can do in a computer. There are some versions that have a lot of evidence to support them, right? They've been used in hundreds of clinical trials. There's evidence that video games, particularly if they're a new stimulus and they're like a complex 3D world, they can significantly improve cognitive function, actually, regardless of your age. And the one that has the most evidence for it, but not that you have to play this one, because like they've seen benefits with like Minecraft and even some like action and shooter games that have like a complex world and you're having to respond to it. And some of them have a social component, right? You're playing Call of Duty with some 12-year-old on the other side of the world. But Super Mario 3D is the one that's been tested in the most studies. So you can actually say that, and another one, StarCraft 2, has been tested in a few studies as well and shows significant improvements in cognitive function. And all of those different things that I mentioned, on like different artistic pursuits, like art and painting and that kind of stuff, counts too. There's a very recent and very nice study that came out. It was published in one of the Nature journals called Creative Experiences and Brain Clocks. And what they did is they took both sort of population data, looking at people who do different creative things or complex skills, and so it was art, languages, music, and video games are in there too. And then they looked at randomized controlled trials as well. And what they saw was that when you engage in these complex skills, the networks in the brain that are most susceptible to the processes of aging improved their function such that your brain looked younger functionally by engaging in these skills. So like, I'm kind of talking about this from like a conceptual, like, here are the skills that you should learn and here's the benefits they have for your brain. But this was actual measured changes in the brain in areas that we know are susceptible to the processes of neurodegeneration and increasing the risk of dementia are, actively made, improved in their function by engaging in these skills. So you can kind of measure this happening in real time, which is very cool.
It makes me think, when you talked about the different categories of physical activity, how it's so much easier once you've gone the round. I've done combat sports when I was younger. I played soccer, I played rugby, I did indoor rowing, weightlifting. Now I like to use the skier, do some strength training, some cycling, some hiking. It's so much easier to just focus on things that you can control, like the strength training and the endurance training, which are both massively beneficial, right? From a function and longevity standpoint. Absolutely. We can, there's no arguing around that. But I like what you said about the technical component and the open skill sports, right? That OODA loop of having to interpret what's going on in the environment and then make a decision as to where you're going to put your body next, and then do that, and then reinterpret the environment and do that over and over and over again, and how really much more demanding that is. And really, really quickly, and how much more demanding that is than sitting on a bike and just moving your legs. And I know it can be very hard, but it's not the same type of hard. And I guess from the brain's perspective, it's not nearly as stimulating as having that interaction. In addition to being in a team, playing with someone, having to communicate, and all of those. So maybe a good argument for not pushing kids too early into, do gymnastics and do endurance training and do weightlifting, because you're going to be a great athlete later on. I definitely think that team sport aspect and that open environment and having to tangle with it is a very important part, right?
Yeah, and part of that, I think you see, particularly in team sports, goes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of learning social communication, emotional regulation. Like, you just can't be the kid who loses their shit like all the time on a team, right? Somebody's gonna put you in check, and you're gonna have to like step up, and you're gonna have to help others, and that, right? So you're gonna learn those skills too, and actually those skills are important for adults as well. We don't always necessarily appreciate that. So yeah, when there are now. There's a huge body of work that in a randomized controlled trial, you might have three groups, right? You might have a sedentary control group, and then you'll have a group that does some kind of unimodal exercise. So they'll sit on a bike or they'll go running or something like that. And then you'll have a group that does some kind of open skill sport. And it could be table tennis, badminton, dancing, right? They've even compared like running around a track versus running around an obstacle course with the same amount of sort of physical difficulty, but with added cognitive difficulty. And what you see is that, yes, those who do physical activity compared to those who do nothing, they significantly improve cognitive function, as you'd expect. Incredibly important. But those who do the complex, whatever the complex open sport skill is, or complex like physical movement is, the level of physical exertion is the same, but you see greater benefits, either more benefits than the physical activity group, or like an even bigger difference compared to the no activity group. And that's in terms of Cognitive function, that's in terms of like measuring changes on a brain scan, right? So parts of the hippocampus might improve their structure more in this more complex group. So yeah, physical, like any kind of physical activity you want to do and that you enjoy, amazing. Please do it. But it's interesting that there seem to be even greater benefits if some of that comes in the form of, you know, a team sport or some other kind of complex sport, especially, you know, interacting with other people or, you know, responding to the environment in real time.
Yeah, because the level of involvement is not the same.
Yeah.
You could pedal not mindlessly on a road, but you don't need to be you don't need to be very present. Whereas if you're going on rocks with a mountain bike, you're fully there, right? You can't be thinking about something else. It's you're there, you're in that moment, and you have to focus. So maybe road runners and road cyclists need to spend more time in the mountains, trail running and and mountain biking in the off season, and that would do them some good. Is there any way, in your opinion, that, switching topics here, is there any way that AI can not be detrimental to brain function?
Yeah, this is like the big debate right now, and understandably so. There is some interesting studies. Like there was one that was from MIT that got a ton of press recently, even though there were a couple of interesting things about it that are just worth bringing up at the start. One is that it was a preprint, so it hadn't yet actually been formally like published in a journal and gone through peer review and stuff like that. So, you know, some of those things change as the reviewers ask questions, and you know maybe some of the results get taken out or modified. And I'll tell you what the study was in a second. But and then the other thing was that this paper was like 200 pages long. It was huge. So like anybody who's online saying, "Hey, AI causes brain rot," I guarantee you they did not read this paper because it was epic. But basically what they did is they took students and then they had them do different essay writing tasks with different levels of technological support. So one was just like, you have to write this essay like from your brain. The next was you can use Google if you want, and then the next was you can use generative AI to help you. And basically what they saw was that as you went down that increasing sort of technical support, the less your brain was engaged in that task, and unsurprisingly, because you're something else is doing that task for you, or at least some of it, and the less you remembered about your own work, because again, like you weren't engaged in it. Now, people kind of lost their minds over this, but this is like, it makes perfect sense. Like, there's nothing surprising here, right? If you're not doing the task, your brain is less engaged in it, and you'll remember less of it. Like at the surface, like that doesn't have to be a big deal at all, because it's just like the brain doing what the brain does. The question then becomes, what are you allowing technology to do that is a skill or function that you want your brain to have, that because you've offloaded it, your brain is going to lose that skill, right? We know, any skill we've talked about today, any physical function, any brain function, you stop stimulating that, you stop creating demand in that tissue, that the function is going to decline, right? The body is constantly matching function to demand. Demand decreases, function will decrease at the same time. So the way of, like, because this is always going to change. So like when we're talking about LLMs in late 2025, AI in 2030 is going to be completely different. Like I have no idea what that's going to look like. So we just need, so I have like a litmus test, which is that if, is this use of this technology, AI, for instance, is this augmenting or supporting some skill that I want to have? Or is it causing that skill to atrophy, right? So you can just think about it like that. Is it creating stimulus or is it decreasing stimulus? If it's decreasing stimulus, is that a skill or function that I want to be better at? So if I want to be better at writing, I just wrote a book. I didn't use AI, and like I suffered and sucked and failed and like said stuff to my editor who was like, why don't we just try this from the top? Let's just throw this away and start again. Right, I wanted to get better at the skill of writing, so I actually wrote it. But when in my work, right, I do a lot of science, right? I'm a scientist by trade, so that involves a lot of data, analyzing a lot of data. I do most of my data analysis in R, which is a statistical coding language. If I know what algorithm I want and how I want to analyze my data, but it requires like this really complex loop of coding functions that are going to take me 2 hours to code, ChatGPT can do that for me in 10 minutes. Or less, like 10 minutes with me like iterating that. So like I'm still doing the important part of my work. I'm thinking like, what do my data look like? How am I going to analyze them? I'm structuring it so that I can answer my question. I'm interpreting the output, but I'm saving like some time that I don't need to spend doing that. And actually, I need to still know, I still need to still have good enough coding skills to be able to debug the code that ChatGPT writes, because it's most of the time it's not perfect off the bat. So in that case, I feel like it's augmenting this part of my job and these skills that I want. But there are plenty of scientists, including some of my colleagues, who are using LLMs to design the experiment, analyze the data, and then write it up in a paper. We're like, well, ChatGPT did science. You did not do science. You did nothing. All you did was write prompts. And so those scientific analytical skills will atrophy, I think, as a result. So that's how I see it, right? Are you using it as like an orthotic, as a supportive thing to do your jobs better and support the skills you want to have, or are you offloading skills that actually are probably important, and as a result, your skills might decline?
Yeah, I think that's, again, we go back to the level of involvement that you have with the process, right?
Exactly.
Whether it's the physical, the cognitive process is how involved are you, how present are you, and how much effort are you putting into it. And if you are using it as, I like to use it as almost like a wrestling partner in thought of trying to figure things out in my own mind, but asking a question, see what it comes back with, and then try to go be deeper, or maybe better formulate questions around those things. But like you said, if you just offset all your work that you're supposed to do to it, well, your brain doesn't work and it doesn't get the benefit from that. I guess the opposite of this might be, or the opposite of the, let's call it, less optimal use of AI towards brain function. The opposite of this would be brain training. And I remember reading about this in Alex Hutchinson's book, Endure, which is absolutely fantastic. Talk a little bit about how you can actually train your brain, and more specifically, what can be done around sports, and how that can actually help in that realm.
Yeah. So just to kind of like complete that previous thought there, I think it's worth bearing in mind that like not all technology has to be bad, and we've kind of assumed that like there's this blanket like technology is going to be bad for your brain, right? But what's interesting, and there was this phrase coined called digital dementia. It was coined by a German psychologist a couple of decades ago. And when you look at what people are worried about in terms of how technology is going to negatively affect our brains, it's usually one is that it's going to stop you engaging in actual things with your brain, right? That's the kind of stuff that we've talked about. So I think we know how we can navigate that, as long as we're actually like thinking about it. And then the other one is that it's going to stop us engaging in all these other things that are important: physical activity, sleep, social connection, nutritious diets, that kind of stuff. So like the risk factors for digital dementia are actually the same for actual dementia, right? So as long as sitting in front of a video game is not stopping you going outside, having friends, running around, sleeping, that kind of stuff, then I think actually it can be a novel stimulus. It requires you to respond to the environment, often solve complex problems, right? Sometimes it has a social component. So it can be a new beneficial stimulus in your environment, right? And I think multiple different aspects of technology can do that. And so when you're then applying this to actually, actively creating stimulus in the brain, then a brain training is one of the sort of outputs of that, or one of the ways to do that. And it's been around for a while, the idea of brain training, sort of on a computer for 30 plus years. And there's been quite a lot of pushback against it. Like, does it actually enhance cognitive function? And it's a good question, because brain training, right, on a flat screen, is often quite simplistic. It's very different from that learning environment we talked about earlier, right? Climbing a tree or playing a team sport, right? Just like the level of complexity is just inherently different. And a lot of the sort of quote unquote evidence for brain training is basically that if you have somebody and you train them on some task on a computer, they get better at that task on a computer. And you're like, well, I could have told you that already. Like, we don't need a study to tell you, like, this is just humans doing what humans do, or like animals do. Like, a rat can do that. Does that mean that you've significantly improved overall cognitive function and that you're going to decrease the risk of dementia? No, it doesn't. So like, there's a big chunk of brain training evidence that kind of fits in that bucket. Now,
but I guess you could still argue that having extra cognitive load on the brain during a physical task, and arguably a difficult physical task, will then help you handle more cognitive load during a difficult task in the future.
Oh yeah. So like, this is I'm building your world of cognitive training, right? So just kind of acknowledging that some of it was not very good, but there's still a bunch of evidence, both for regular people and then for athletes, and I'm going to go through them in that order.
Go for it.
So one of the best studies of brain training that actually like meaningfully moved the needle in people was done in the 90s, and it was called the ACTIVE study. Nearly 3,000 people, sort of older adults, 60s and older, randomized to 4 different groups. They had a control group. They had a memory training group, so they were told how to learn like mnemonics and things like that to kind of better remember things. There was a reasoning group, which was sort of like looking for patterns in numbers and words. And then there was a processing speed group, where they had to like recognize objects that like flashed quickly on a screen, and then had to like do kind of 2 different tasks on the screen at the same time. And this is in the 90s, so it wasn't fancy on a computer. If anybody remembers what their computers were like in the 90s. And then they did this for a couple of months. It was like 10 training sessions in a few weeks, and then they had some like refreshers, like a year and 3 years later. 5 years out, all the people who were in one of the training groups had improved quality of life, and those who were in the processing speed group were more likely to be independent and still drive their cars and stuff like that 5 years after the task. So like, just a couple of months of fairly basic brain training, and like actually moving the needle on something that's important, right? Like, they didn't just get like better at the game. The processing speed training group seemed to be best, and that's probably because, right, if you're out in the world and you're driving and you're doing all this kind of stuff, being able to process lots of information quickly is really critical, and that's something that does on average kind of decline as we get older. And that the task that they did is now rolled into the brain training platform that probably has the best evidence behind it, which is called Brain HQ, which was developed by Mike Merzenich. I have no relationship to them. They just have a lot of evidence for what they do. They just had a paper that just came out that using their platform, you could measure changes in acetylcholine signaling, which is lost in dementia. That you could measure changes in that signaling in the brain after doing this brain training. So like, quite a lot of evidence to support it. So some of that is beneficial for just like the average population, but then you asked about athletes. So this falls under the umbrella usually of something called brain endurance training. So there are a ton of different ways to do this depending on your sport, but it could be doing cognitive tasks whilst you're doing some kind of unimodal exercise, right? So like, you're on a treadmill or you're on a bike and you're doing cognitive tasks, like and then what happens as a result is exactly what you said. So at the time, you might be less good at the cognitive task, and you might be able to sustain a lower power output during the exercise, right? Because you're using your brain to do this other thing, right? You're not just focusing on working hard. But later on, you might have greater time to exhaustion, or you're able to maintain a higher output for longer because you've trained your brain to be able to work hard while you're working physically hard. And there are other versions of this which they've done in like soccer players and paddle players, where they do some kind of brief burst of activity, like some kind of sprint or interval training, and then in the breaks they'll go and do some cognitive tasks, and you broadly see the same effect. So it's training your brain to be able to function better under significant physical load, and that then translates to some improvements in physical performance. And what I will say is that most of the ways that it's been done historically are just really boring. Like, have you ever done a Stroop task? Is where like the words flash up and the word spells a color and it is a color, and you have to like say the color the word is and not the color the word says. That's a Stroop task. And there are like studies where people are on a treadmill for an hour doing Stroop tests. Like, that is the most boring thing I can possibly think of. Like, and it's really like eating a whole plate full of broccoli because somebody's like, "This is good for you. Like, you have to eat all the broccoli because it's good for you." Like, I don't want to. However, there's good evidence for that. It's just the fact that when you then try and use that with athletes, I work with a lot of professional elite level athletes. Telling them to do that, they're going to tell you where to go very quickly. They're like, I'm not going to do this.
I worked with a team of sailors a little while back, and they had grinders or winches on the boat, so they were essentially pedaling with their arms, and they had to also then make decisions in real time on the boat. And one of the guys that I was training said that physically he was feeling good, but then he had a hard time making decisions when he was in a hard place physically on the boat. And so I hadn't, looked into the literature or read any studies. I just figured, well, let's start doing things while you're doing your grinder in the gym. And so the first thing I gave him is just listen to a podcast. Listen to a podcast with intent during your threshold intervals. And I want you to remember things, and I want you to write them down after your intervals, because that's just going to force you to just be present while it sucks. And he did say that just even a few sessions doing that over a few weeks, he did feel like on the boat, even though he was feeling really tired, he was able to just be more mentally present. And obviously, I'm sure we could have done much better with much more advanced platforms and tests and methods. But I figured it was probably the simplest way of doing it, and also the least boring thing to do versus having to set up, find an app, find the platform, set it up. And I'm sure once it's set up, it's super easy to use. But those guys don't have fingers because they're with their arms. So they can't like push buttons with their noses or anything. And I figured, that might be the simplest way of doing it and still get a benefit.
Yeah. So I think that's, and this is kind of where I'm starting to go, is that some of this has to be practical, right? So I think that the solution you came up with is a good one. You just have to find something else to really concentrate on and be forced to concentrate on when you're physically fatigued. The more it relates to your actual sport, great. So like, if maybe it's in that scenario, it could be a record. It could even be a recording. Like, what, I don't know what decisions a grinder has to make when he's in a boat. But like, if it's just like somebody, and we do this. So in drivers, like Formula One drivers, if they're in the simulator, you'll often have an engineer who's just like throwing stuff at them, right, to increase the cognitive complexity and the load, like while they're training. And so it could be something like that. There are some apps where you can respond like with your voice. So the best platform in terms of the evidence for brain endurance training is one called Soma. If people want to try this, like, again, they have a lot of evidence to support them, and some of their tasks you can just say the answer, and you're doing this right. So if your hands are taken, you can just say it. However, like, what I'm most excited about is starting to translate these things into virtual reality. So there are some platforms where you can start to do this in VR, right? So first of all, it's fully immersive visually. You also have an audio component and a physical movement component, because it can, like, some of them, not like a Meta Quest, which is probably the most popular and most common, but like some of the more advanced platforms can track your eyes. They can track, right? They know where your head is. They can track your hands. So you can start to integrate multiple cognitive and physical demands at the same time in a way that's much more similar to how we use our brains in the real world. So, some of the, like, we're just starting up a study to look at some of this, which will be a combination of, first we'll create physical fatigue, and then we'll start to do complex cognitive training in 3D in virtual reality. And I think as that improves, we're going to be able to get much more realistic demands, and I think we'll see much bigger improvements in cognitive function, just because it's much more similar to how you're then gonna do this stuff out in the real world. So we're kind of right at the beginning of some of that, and I think it's super exciting.
That is very exciting. Looking forward to seeing where this goes. I know we have a few more minutes, Doc. I wanted to ask one last question. Can you talk about light exposure and brain health for us?
Yeah. So I'm sure by now, now that we've gotten into the middle of the third decade of the 21st century, like, people have started to appreciate circadian biology, right? We know that everything kind of happens on a regular schedule. Probably the majority of functions in the body follow this kind of daily rhythm, and sort of similar to what I mentioned earlier, the body is constantly trying to align functions with what's expected in terms of what needs to happen. So the brain kind of prepares itself for sleep as not when you are going to sleep, like in the hours before. It's already preparing, right? It's releasing melatonin. It's there are like fluid clearance pathways in the brain that sort of like wash everything out overnight to help reset for the next day. They start to expand even before you fall asleep, and all of this is kind of driven by the inputs that we give to the brain. And the most important Zeitgeber, which is the word for the things that dictate our circadian rhythm, is light. So there are lots of studies that suggest that having bright early morning light that's important for kind of setting the rhythm, and then darkness at night is also important, but they're kind of equally important. And if you don't have bright morning light, then you're more susceptible to light at night in terms of being able to sleep. And there's also evidence that, and this is sort of like big population data, because it's hard to kind of really measure very tightly in a person, but having less light during the day and more light at night is associated with higher risks of cognitive decline and dementia, both on the individual level and kind of the population level. When you think about the things that increase alertness, bright light is one of the most important. And so, like, first thing in the day, you're trying to set the system, you're trying to become alert. Bright light is really important, and the light that you get from inside is not necessarily that bright, right? It feels bright, but sort of relative to being outside, even on a cloudy day, it's much less light. So if you're not being able to get outside, there are some ways you can use light boxes and things like that. They can improve alertness, they can improve mood, just because these are important. These lights are important biological inputs. And then the same in the evening. You're less light at night. Sleep masks, if there's light in the room. These sort of like help set the rhythm, and we know that cognitive function seems to improve if we kind of have those kind of two opposites that occur during the day.
Tommy, that was a lot of fun, and I learned a whole bunch of things. So I want to just thank you first and foremost for coming on the show and talking to us about all this. I feel like there's probably enough to go for 2 or 3 hours. You have a book, like you said. You have a book, The Stimulated Mind. It's just right behind you. Where can we find the book? And give us a 20-second intro for people that might be interested in reading it.
Yeah, thanks. So The Stimulated Mind, it comes out March 2026. it's essentially a lot of what we talked about today, but it's what is the strategy and then the tactics for improving cognitive function today and then preventing or minimizing the risk of dementia long term. So kind of towards the end of the book, I provide the model that I've talked about today, the 3S model. But before that, I talk about like how we can build capacity in the system, this thing that I call headroom. That's resilience that I mentioned right at the beginning. It's reserve, like how do you have just extra buffer when you need it as you get older? How do you build those things? So there's chapters on like all the stuff on physical activity, all the stuff on diet, stress management and mitigation, sleep, social connection, and it's a popular science book. It's written for the average individual, but it also has 1,800 references. So if anybody like really wants to dig into the science, and each one of them was read by me and not hallucinated by ChatGPT, so. I think it kind of gives this full overarching look at like all the things that we can do like in the workday today, as well as, sort of long term to improve cognitive function. You can go to thestimulatedmind.com. It's available for pre-order anywhere you order books from. And then sort of in the intermediate time, on Instagram at Dr. Tommy Wood, I'll post like podcasts and things like this, and links to the book and more about the book as it comes out. And then I also have a Substack where you just the URL is betterbrain.fitness that I share with my colleague Josh Turkner, who's a neurologist, and we have a podcast as well. And the Substack is free, and you sort of like get all those kind of materials through it. The podcast is mainly question and answer. So if I said anything today, we were like, I'd like to hear more about that, or that doesn't make sense, Tommy, like you're an idiot. Please send us a question, and I'll admit why I was an idiot on the podcast gladly. That's how the podcast works. So please join the Substack for free, and then if you're interested in more of what we talked about today, thestimulatedmind.com and the book, we'll have all of that in there.
Amazing. All 3 links will be in the description, so people can just easily click and follow you. And like you said, ask more questions, go a little bit deeper, and learn more about the brain. Thank you so much, Tommy. It was a pleasure having you on, man, and I hope we could do it again soon.
Yeah, thanks so much. This was fantastic. I really appreciate it.
Take care, man.
You too. Cheers.
Before I let you go, I want to tell you a little bit more about this podcast sponsor. All You Need Nutrition is a high-quality supplement brand proudly made in France. When they first reached out to me, my wife, who's a trained nutritionist, had a lot of questions about the different ingredients that they use. So we scheduled a call with Miriam, the mastermind behind the entire All You Need product line. After the call that lasted almost 2 hours, my wife was really impressed by their transparency and the quality of their products. She was excited to work with a brand like All You Need. And if my wife says yes to a supplement brand, I'm on board without hesitation. Personally, I love their whey protein. I use it after every strength session or mix it in with my yogurt in the morning when I want a little extra protein. It's not too sweet, the cocoa flavor is delicious, and it blends really well. Their one product is fantastic if you're looking for a light energy boost plus all the vitamins and minerals you might need if you're used to training hard. My wife sticks to 1 scoop, but I go for 2. Make sure you find the dose that works for you. And special shout out to their shaker bottle. It's literally the best shaker I've used in the past 15 years. We've been using their supplements for the last 2 months, and we're genuinely thrilled to be working with them. If you want to support the podcast, click the link in the description to check out their whole product line and use the code UPSIDE for 10% off on your next order with All You Need Nutrition. Take care and see you in the next episode.